Sevgili dostlar, değerli izleyiciler, Fikir Önderleri buluşmalarımıza hepiniz hoş geldiniz efendim. Harvard Business Review olarak fikir önderleriyle sizleri buluşturmaya, farklı konuları, farklı konseptleri derinlemesine iş dünyasında işleyecek olan yeni bakış açılarını hep birlikte ele almaya devam ediyoruz. Bugün de çok değerli bir konuğumuzla birlikte farklı bir alanda sohbet edeceğiz. Sohbete başlamadan önce birkaç ufak hatırlatmayı sizlerle paylaşmayı arzu ediyorum. Malumunuz yayınlarımız Twitter, Instagram ve YouTube'dan aynı anda canlı olarak gerçekleşiyor. Bize soru sormak isterseniz sizleri YouTube kanalımıza bekliyoruz. YouTube'daki o sağ taraftaki chat box'a sorularınızı yazarsanız ben de onları yeri geldiğinde ve zamanımız kaldığı sürece sonrasında sevgili konuğumuza iletmeye ve sizin adınıza yanıt almaya gayret edeceğim. Bugün çok değerli bir konuk aramızda olacak. Harvard Business School'dan Max Bazerman. Max Bazerman benim yakından takip ettiğim ve gerçekten çalışmalarını çok değerli bulduğum müzakere alanında, karar verme alanında ve davranış ekonomisi alanında çok ciddi çalışmaları ve bugüne kadar bu literatüre ve yaklaşımlara çok ciddi katkısı olan çok değerli bir akademisyen. Şimdi kendisini yayına davet ediyorum. Max, welcome to the stream.
Welcome to you, Mr. Dar. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's always a pleasure to have you, Max, and congratulations for your latest book, Better, Not Perfect, A Realist's Guide to Maximum Sustainable Good. I really enjoyed this book, and I think it's really a guideline for understanding the ethical approaches of today and tomorrow. So, what is this concept of maximum sustainable good? What drove you to write this book?
What drove me to write this book is that I think that many of us can create more value in the world. We can create more value for ourselves, but more importantly, we can create more value for other people in the broader society. So the term maximal sustainable goodness comes from the notion that if we tell people that they should act in a perfectly ethical way, we would need to define what that means. In the book, I think of perfectly ethical as coming out of the philosophy called Utilitarianism, which means the decision that maximizes the value for all. But to imagine that you could go through your entire life and always make the decision that would create the most value for all is unreasonable and unobtainable. So what this book is about is how to aim to create more value in your life, to create more value next year than you did last year, and to be on the continual path toward ethical betterment without any notion that any of us could get to perfection. In the decision-making literature, we often hear the term rationality, and we want decisions to be more rational, but we know that humans are limited in their ability to reach that goal. The concept of rationality is useful, even if we can't act perfectly rational, if we can try to move in the direction of greater and greater rationality. And in the case of ethics, if we move in the direction of creating more and more good and to try to be better, even if we can't be perfect, we can move toward a more ethical and sustainable life.
Right. Moving to more ethical and sustainable life for a person seems to be a really good purpose, but it is harder to encourage others to be more ethical. I think individuals can have an ethical perspective for themselves, which is not easy to establish though. But how about encouraging others to be more ethical? What are some right ways to do that?
I think that there's lots of things that leaders can do to encourage others in their organization to be more ethical. But to start with, for the leader to be more ethical is an important first step. So the people in the organization pay attention to what the leader does. So the leader is modeling for us what the right way to behave in the organization is. So when the leader departs from ethicality, others are too often soon to follow. So I think that we want the leader to act ethically. We want the leader to be clear about the value of ethics in their organization. And we want the leader to highlight that if you simply do what's in your own best interest, that doesn't make you ethical, that we want to move to a broader and broader definition of ethicality. So we want people to stop thinking about themselves and think about their unit. We want people to go beyond their unit and to think about the organization overall. And we want people to realize that organizations exist in the broader society, and it's ethically important for organizations to contribute to the broader society, not just to maximize shareholder wealth.
Right. Maximizing shareholder wealth has been going under a significant criticism for the last couple of years. We have been writing so much articles about how to fix capitalism, and those kind of issues are so hot. When ethicality clashes with profitability, what happens? So when a leader thinks that being ethical means losing money, what will be her and his his and her approach to that?
So I heard a number of important questions there, which I'm going to try to unpack a little bit. So to begin with, this notion of the organization's objective is to maximize shareholder wealth, that really goes back to Milton Friedman, who argued that it was the ethical responsibility of organizations to maximize shareholder wealth. But that was simply an economist's opinion about ethics. It did not come out of the philosophical literature on ethics. It was one person's opinion, and unfortunately, too many people accepted his view as a statement of law, as a statement of fact, when it was simply his opinion. I think that maximizing shareholder wealth has to be one criteria for a sustainable organization. So the last thing I want to tell a corporation is that they should ignore shareholders' wealth. Of course, they should pay attention to shareholders' wealth. But it could very well be the case that the organization is more stable, more long-lasting, has a greater probability of existing 50 years from now if it's embedded in the broader society and contributes to making the broader society a healthier and more viable place. So I think that focusing only on shareholders' wealth typically leads to short-termism and is in fact a danger to the organization because you end up expressing too many values that are inconsistent with the broader society.
Great. So being ethical seems to be very obvious, very natural, but very few of us take this as one of the main stands. So what are some systematic barriers that are standing up in the way of being more ethical?
Yeah, so again, I want to start with sort of the view that I'm offering of what is more ethical. And I'm defining more ethical as creating more value. Okay, so creating more value for all, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain for all rather than for self. I think too often people limit ethics to a set of rules. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. And I think when we think about ethics in a broader context of how much good are you creating in the world, it becomes less obvious what the ethical behavior is, and it requires more thought. But I think that we have a variety of limitations to why we don't act more ethically. To begin with, we trust our own intuition to define ethics. In decision-making, we know that when leaders use their intuition rather than think about problems more deliberatively, they make worse decisions. Deliberation outperforms intuition on a consistent and repeated basis. Similarly, deliberation leads people to make more ethical decisions than what their first impulse tells them. So slowing down and thinking about important problems in a more systematic way is one way to make more ethical decisions, and it requires sort of getting over the barrier that so many of us have of thinking our intuition is flawless. We also make unethical decisions because we don't plan in advance. So in my country, we currently see so many thousands of people dying from the COVID crisis. And one of the main reasons that they're dying is that the administration of the US government failed to plan for the COVID crisis. And once the crisis hit, they didn't engage in the long-term planning for what will get us to the end of the COVID crisis in an efficient way. So when we don't plan, we end up creating ethical problems because people are dying because of the failure to plan. So planning becomes, the failure to plan becomes a barrier to making more ethical decisions. Short-termism is another problem. When we sort of think in the short term, fail to think about future years or even future generations, we act unethically. So ignoring climate change is an ethical failure that too many people and nations are guilty of. And when we focus too much on ourselves and not enough on other people, I think that becomes another barrier to engaging in more ethical actions. So in Better Not Perfect, I try to delineate a whole host of reasons or barriers to why we don't act more ethically on a more regular basis.
Right. There are, maybe the list will go longer and longer and longer because it is really personal and general at the same time. But one of the very interesting thing is the timing of this book, because we were just going through this COVID phenomenon, and we still haven't felt the main pain of aftermath of COVID, if I may say. There are lots of pessimistic projections about the trajectory of economy. There are lots of research saying that lots of jobs will be lost, lots of revenues will evaporate, the supply chains will be redistributed and reconstructed. So there will be problematic, turbulent times in waiting for us, let's say, in the near future. So those kind of turbulent times when you lose your own playbook and when things go up and down, many people find it harder to find their true compass. So do you think that the aftermath of COVID will be more challenging for ethical behavior and ethical decisions?
Absolutely. I think from start to finish, we see a variety of ethical and decision-making challenges. So if we go back to February, March, April, when the COVID crisis first sort of hit so many of our countries, we first thought about it in terms of a health problem. How are we going to solve this health problem? But soon, many leaders, particularly authoritarian leaders, and I'm certainly including the United States in that, became focused on, but what about the economy? And pitted health versus economy. We can't stay closed forever. We have to open up for economic reasons. But if we take a long-term economic perspective, one of the best things that we could have done would have been to close our economies faster and to create a true shutdown to deal with the health crisis. And after a small period of suffering, we could have restarted, having solved our health problems, and to see our economic system boom. And we see that in countries that were future-oriented from the beginning of the crisis. So we saw this false dichotomy of health versus the economy, when what we really needed to do was take a long-term perspective. Now that we're in October of 2020, and it's clear that the COVID is lasting far longer than it should have because of our terrible decisions, I do think that we need to think about how are we going to return to a new normal. I don't think we're going to return to the old normal. I think we're going to return to a new normal where many of our restaurants are not going to return. People are going to think about entertainment and dining in fundamentally different ways for multiple years to come. So I think so kind of like the digital transformation, it's not how do we get back to the way the world was. How do we get back to a healthy new normal moving forward? And I think that the most ethical thing we can do is to continue to think from a long-term perspective, to think in advance about what are we going to do when the vaccine is discovered? Who gets it first? How are we going to distribute it? How are we going to create a system that makes sense to create the most value possible, rather than to deal with special interests, which too often dominate in terms of who gets scarce resources.
Right. Speaking of ethics, I can say there are two very solid camps on that. Philosophers just trying to argue what should we do, and psychologists argue what we actually do. So in your book, you are introducing a prescriptive approach other than these two approaches. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So for the last couple of decades, we've seen a boom in the research of psychologists who describe how people ethically behave. And this is quite revolutionary, because up until the new millennium, ethics was largely in the hands of philosophers who told us how we should behave. And they would have very elaborate logic for what constitutes an optimal decision. So I mentioned earlier utilitarianism. Utilitarian philosophers define the optimal ethical decision from the point of view of maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, or what I would describe as creating the most value. So you have a normative description on the one hand, you have a descriptive account on the other hand. And what my book does, just as much of my work in decision-making and negotiation does, is it tries to pursue a third perspective, or what I describe as prescriptive, or how do we get people to move closer to the normative standard, rather than simply assuming if we tell them what the normative standard is that they will get there. So I'm specifically interested in prescribing ideas for ourselves, but also ideas for affecting the behavior of other people that will move them toward more value creation for the rest of their lives.
Right. And a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the rationality concept. And as much as I know, you have done some work on bounded rationality concept, which is also very important for ethical behavior. So can you just give us some extra elaboration on the bounded rationality concept and how it affects the ethical behavior?
I'm happy to. Thank you for the question. So to start with, historically, economists in their traditional economic models have assumed that humans are fully rational, and that they model human behavior as being fully rational. One of the major evolutions in the field of economics, which really comes out of the work of psychologists, is the topic of bounded rationality, or within what's now called behavioral economics. And behavioral economics describes the systematic and predictable ways in which human beings depart from rationality. So we're affected by the frame in which information is presented. We tend to escalate our commitment to a prior course of action. We tend to be overconfident. So we could identify the systematic and predictable mistakes that people make. It turns out that many of those mistakes not only lead to worse decisions, but they also lead to less ethical decisions. And my colleagues and I use the term bounded ethicality to talk about the systematic and predictable ways in which perfectly good people behave unethically without even being aware that they're doing so. So we don't intend to act sexist. We don't intend to act racist. But some of us have biases toward the preferred group in ways that we're not even aware of. So within the realm of discrimination, the idea of bounded ethicality highlights the ways in which we might discriminate without intention to do so. And from a prescriptive perspective, we want to identify how do we eliminate these barriers to ethicality.
Right. One of the things that you highlight more often is creating value, more value, and not more value for oneself, but for more value for all the stakeholders, for the others as well. But when you look at the general applications of how people perceive value or create value, most of the humans, I think we are fixed to create value for ourselves only, or for ourselves first. how can we create more value for others as well? What should we do for that?
Yeah, so to give the simplest example, as you know, Serdar, I teach negotiations a great deal. And I teach an executive program at the Harvard Business School called Changing the Game. And on November 1st, I'll meet, 40 or 50 or 60 new executives who will show up for this program. And many of them will have what we call in the negotiations literature a mythical fixed pie. They assume that what's good for you is bad for me, and what's bad for you is good for me in negotiations. And a core concept that we see not only in negotiation training at the Harvard Business School, but in every leading business school in the world, is that even experienced negotiators too often destroy value by not realizing that there are trades to be made, that there are multiple issues involved in most complex negotiations. And we can create value by if I give you what you care more about and you give me what I care more about in return. So if rather than thinking about negotiations along a straight line where you want a low price and I want a high price, if we think about it in two-dimensional space and think about how do we grow the pie, what we find is that there are enormous opportunities to do so. When we move from negotiations to ethics, there are simply more people involved. And I would argue that many of the people listening to this show want to be better people. They want to create more value. They want to contribute more to the world. And Better Not Perfect is really focused on how do you do this? And how do you even create more value without necessarily reducing your own value at all? And I think that there are numerous ways that we can do that, from making sure that we don't support corruption, by reducing waste in society, by using our time where it can create the most value. If we donate to charity, donating it to the charities that are going to create the most good with our philanthropic dollars. All of these kinds of decisions create more value. And if we sort of go about auditing our life and ask, how could we use our time and our resources to create more value for others, we can often do so while leading a happier and more rewarding life for ourselves.
Right. There will always be some unethical behavior around. There will always be some people who are acting unethical and setting traps. But it is surprising to see that after all these books, all these researches, and all this information and news flowing around, still lots of people fall in that trap. You mentioned Madoff's scheme, the Ponzi scheme in your book. We had a similar one, I think more creative one here in Turkey, which is called Çiftlik Bank. I will give you more detail about that. But at the end of the day, still people fall in these traps. So why couldn't we notice that? Is there a problem with us?
So I did read about Çiftlik Bank, and it is a fascinating story. But before talking about this Turkish story, let me mention Madoff, because Madoff was a $60 billion Ponzi scheme where a very well-known finance guy is taking in people's investments and basically stealing it and providing pseudo accounts. And this went on for many, many, many years. And the stunning aspect of the Madoff story is that he was reporting returns that were not technically possible. For the finance folks in the audience, for 9 years, providing quarterly returns, he basically had stable returns that had essentially no variance that dramatically outperformed the market. Now, there's lots of people in the finance world who know you cannot dramatically outperform the market over a 9-year period of time without having any volatility. But so many people who had the expertise to know looked at Madoff's returns and didn't notice the impossible. And in terms of the Turkish story that you mentioned, I would highlight in that story, the investment opportunity that the founder was claiming to provide simply never made any sense. It doesn't make sense that you can sort of invest real money into a virtual currency, into a farming scheme that has no biological logic to it, and everybody can get 200% returns. There's no logic to put this together. What I want to highlight is that I don't think I know, nor do I think anyone else knows, how do we keep the next crook from coming along? I think we're going to have other charlatans, other bad guys in the future. But what we can do a far better job of is having people throughout society who notice when there's corruption around us, when people are making claims that aren't possible. When it's too good to be true, you should be aware that it's too good to be true. And so often, all that's required is digging in a little bit and checking the data. And when we do that, we can see opportunities to basically stand up and note the corruption around us. Too often we don't do that. I think we need to do that with corrupt political leaders. I think we need to do that with corrupt corporate leaders. I think we need to do that with people who are trying to sell us something that is, quote, too good to be true.
Right. So it's fascinating to see that there are lots of actually good people doing some bad things, and they do that regularly. And you see some people super ethical in one part and super evil at the other part. So this is also a reflection that has a reflection in philanthropy as well. So why good people or naturally good people do bad things and they act super ethical in one area and they are evil in the other?
Yeah, so many in your audience will recall the name Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie still, and he also has his name over 300 libraries in the United States. And Andrew Carnegie, more than 100 years ago, was a famous industrialist who was truly terrible to his employees. He abused employees. He arguably was involved in the death of many of his employees. He was ruthless in firing people for very limited reasons. And from a leadership perspective, I would describe him as a highly unethical leader. Yet other people think of Andrew Carnegie as a very ethical person because he donated so much to philanthropy. So that there are lots of institutions in New York and in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that have the Andrew Carnegie name on it. And so you can see the same person who is ruthlessly unethical as a leader and amazingly ethical on the philanthropy side. And my reaction is that one doesn't eliminate the harm of the other, that leaders should be held accountable for all of their actions, not just the ones that they choose to emphasize. And more recently, there's a family in the US that has controlled a company called Purdue Pharmaceuticals that basically was probably the most important creator of what's described as the opioid crisis in the United States, which has again resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of people. The Sackler's name is also all over lots of philanthropical organizations, and they've been major contributors to many universities, including my own. And again, I would highlight that sort of engaging in a variety of good behaviors doesn't eliminate the harm of other behaviors. And I think that all of us can stop and look at the good and the bad that we create, and there's more work to do where we might be doing some harms, even if we haven't been focusing on them in the past.
Max, we have been going through tough times, and there are some really wicked problems that we have to solve, like climate issues or wealth distribution or reduction of waste, or using our time efficiently. So how are some of the concepts you introduced in the book can be used to have better results in these kind of wicked problems?
So I think that that we can do a much better job of helping people understand their own behavior. So I think that there's no scientific doubt that climate change is occurring and humans are helping to cause it. Okay, you can also talk to lots of people who will tell you that they want to leave the world in a better condition for their grandchildren than the way they inherited the world. Yet, when we destroy the earth and the systems that are required for a healthy environment around the earth, we have to think about future generations. And when we ignore climate change, when we deny climate change, when we put economic interests completely above climate change, what we're doing is we're stealing from the future. And that's an unethical act. And when some people say climate change might exist, but jobs are more important, you have to ask, whose jobs? It might be our current jobs are important. But what about jobs in the future that are going to be dramatically affected if we destroy our environment? So I think that across lots of these problems, I think we want to become more aware of the implications of our actions, and that leads us to wiser societal responses. And if we want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, we want to be on the correct side of that debate in terms of creating the most value for all, not only in our current generation, but future ones as well.
All right. There are some questions coming from the audience, Max. I think it's a good time to tap into some of those. I will be just reading there. One question is about the corporation's real intention to be ethical and sustainable. We were thinks that most of the companies or organizations are using ethics and sustainability as tools for promotion and for just using them as show-offing. So how serious do you think corporations are into this ethical and sustainability issues?
So I think, like any other dimension, corporations vary. Some are doing great and some are doing quite poorly. And we want to move organizations in the right direction. Personally, I'm happy that organizations want to be perceived as good ethical actors. So the fact that they want to be perceived as good ethical actors is likely to move them in that right direction. The fact that employees want to work for ethical organizations means that corporations need to behave more ethically in order to attract the right employees. The fact that more and more investors want to invest in ethical organizations makes being an ethical organization more attractive. So rather than sort of are corporations sort of sincere, my reaction is that they vary. And I think that more and more organizations are moving in the right direction. So, Sardar, as you know from many of our conversations before today, one of the areas that I'm interested in is how to reduce animal suffering. That animals suffer far too much on factory farms. And one of the solutions is to create alternatives to dairy and meat that people will in fact be fascinated to buy. And there's a company in the US called Beyond Meat, and they're the first significant alternative meat company that's had their IPO. And when the IPO hit, it just boomed. And what we find is that there's a world of eaters, there's a world of investors, there's a world of entrepreneurs who are interested in more ethical decisions. And the fact that there's money to be made, I think, is a good thing, not a bad thing. So I'm happy that the people who created Beyond Meat are becoming extremely wealthy. And I hope it's a good role model of saying, how do we look at a wide variety of ethical problems and find ethical solutions that consumers and citizens and investors are interested in.
Right. Being ethical and profitable at the same time really matters, because it is also like the proof of concept that you can do both and you can improve in both areas. Maybe Patagonia's approach to social impact is also a good example for this. But I know, as you have already said, you have been into this meat alternative business for a while. So it's good to see that it's getting traction as well. So another question is, let me tweak this question a little bit more. Now we are going to a very volatile VUCA world, if I may say. And in VUCA world, how can companies do better by sticking with ethical behavior?
I missed one word there, Sudar. What kind of world?
VUCA, it is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Yeah. So I think that in many cases, preparing for an uncertain world means acting more ethically to prepare for different circumstances. So the example we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, we're entering into a volatile environmental world. Okay, we don't know what the Earth is going to look like 20 years from now. And I think sort of preparing for what science tells us actually leads us toward more ethical behavior. So we often hear we should follow the data. Well, the data in terms of the environment is that the globe is warming up and that humans are causing it. And I think that there's good money to be made in finding the solutions of creating more sustainable products and developing more sustainable ways of living. And I think that there are more and more investors who are interested in exactly those kinds of propositions.
Great. So another question it reads, how the dichotomy occurs when an average person behaves ethically differently according to the enabling environment he or she interacts in terms of culture, company values, and etc.
Absolutely. So it's hard to live in a corrupt society and make your way through the business environment behaving perfectly ethically, no doubt about it. And I think that that's why we want to do our best to change society in more ethical ways. We want to sort of avoid electing unethical leaders. We want to pay attention to the nature of the people running for office. We want to clarify that corruption is not acceptable by our leaders. Sometimes that might mean protests. Sometimes that might be supporting an alternative candidate. But oftentimes the solution can't be done at an individual level, but rather we need to create better systems of governance. And I think that that's true both in the corporate world, but also in the political world.
Another question is about the world even after the Black Death, the plague, have somehow went back to normal. What is different with COVID-19 that we should be ready for a totally new normal?
I think what's different about COVID is that there are many organizations that are just going out of business, so that there are industries that are going to be fundamentally changed as a result. So in the United States, there are projections that 1/3 of all restaurants that existed in 2019 won't exist in 2021. So that's going to be a different world. To the extent that COVID lingers, I think that people are going to sort of consume in different ways. So that creates different kinds of market opportunities. I think that many of us have learned that interacting the way we're acting today has some very positive features to it. So that there's clearly a sense that maybe we didn't need all those office buildings that we had in 2019, that many people are perfectly happy working from home a significant portion of the time. So all of these things that we've learned from such a major event as this pandemic may alter our behavior, not just as we're working our way through the recovery from COVID, but for years to come, as we've learned aspects about our own behavior that will change what's of value. So we're on a sort of digital platform that despite the fact that I'm not that familiar with it, I'm confident that its market value has probably gone up. I know that the value of Zoom has gone up dramatically. So we're valuing different things, and that's always going to have winners and losers, and we want to be able to anticipate that as we make decisions as we get ready for 2021.
Great. Another question is showing the impact investment in a financial sense. It says, how can we incorporate the impact investment activities on the balance sheet of companies as well as profit indicators?
Yeah, so my colleague Robert Kaplan at the Harvard Business School talks about a balanced scorecard, and he provides a sort of a methodology for broadening what it is that we measure and keep track of and value. So I think that from sort of an accounting standpoint, there's probably lots of good things that we can do. But I think that we can also, independent of whether it's on the balance sheet, we can start doing a better job of keeping track of various ethical behaviors that we're involved in. I think large corporations can become leaders on a variety of ethical domains, whether it's sort of being more open to all cultures, being less sexist, rejecting corruption as part of the way we do business. And as we become more ethical in whatever way we choose, I think we can sort of advertise that, provide documentation of it, and potentially become more attractive to a variety of employees, consumers, and investors.
Great. Last but not least, another question is the methods for decision making. It reads, how to decide whether it is better to use decision analysis methods based on analysis and pure rationale, or to use methods that are similar to startups, more aspirational, more gut feeling based. So how structured should we in while taking some important decisions?
Sure. So there was an assumption in that question that startups act intuitively, and I would say that I think startups often have a creative start, that someone came up with a great idea to begin with. But for a startup, I would certainly encourage them to deliberate and think carefully about their most important decisions. And I see lots of startups who are using decision analysis, using learning algorithms, talking to their smart friends, crowdsourcing to put better data together. All of these are methods that go beyond intuition. So I would caution that trusting your intuition comes at a peril, and most of us can make wiser decisions if we can figure out how to use more data, use the decisions and advice of others, and be better informed rather than simply trusting our intuition.
Great. So there are some questions about how to contact you with further questions. So are you on social media, LinkedIn? How can our audience can find a way to contact you?
I'm easy to find, but if you Google Max Harvard Business School, you'll probably find me very quickly. But my email address is mbazerman@hbs.edu, and that's probably the easiest way, but any of the other mechanisms will work as well.
Okay, Max, thank you very much for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I totally think that your book is like a really true North Star throughout these turbulent times in which we should be operational, profitable, as well as ethical and impact oriented as well. So thank you very much for your time and attending to the show.
Thank you, Sridhar, for inviting me onto your show. I appreciate it.
Değerli izleyiciler, çok teşekkür ediyoruz bugün bizlerle birlikte olduğunuz için. Max Bazerman gerçekten bu alandaki en önde gelen isimlerden biri ve uzun yıllardır yaptığı çalışmaların hepsini etik davranış üzerine bu kitapta birleştirdi. Ben çok keyifli okudum, çok değerli bir yayındı. Umarım sizler için de keyifli ve hoş bir sohbet olmuştur. Hepinize tekrardan iyi akşamlar diliyorum. Sağlıklı kalın, mutlu kalın efendim.